Take your skirt pieces and put them together, wrong sides facing each other. We're going to be doing a French seam. Normally for most things you put your fabric right sides together. For French seam you do it wrong sides together. So first of all we're going to match it at the notch here for the zipper. We're going to leave this part open and stitch from here down. Once you've stitched your seam, give it a press, and if you need to, you can trim up any areas like this where the seam allowance is a little bit wider in one spot than the other. Some people also like to just sew with a wide seam allowance, like a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then trim it down to 1/4 inch, but I prefer to just sew it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance in the first place. Once you've pressed your seam on both sides, you need to flip it over, flip it inside out, and then we are going to press this seam so it is creased. This will just make it a lot easier for the next step when we stitch the French seam. Once you've pressed this seam, now we are going to take it to the sewing machine and sew with about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So the idea of the French seam here is that your stitching will enclose the raw edge here. So you'll have like a really, really nice finished seam. Your seam should now be nicely encased like this. So then give it a press and flip it to the right side. Now we need to have a look at our waistband. My fabrics for this project is really thin, so I'm going to add some fusible interfacing. So take it to the iron if you're using fusible interfacing, put your facing gluey side down and put a press cloth on top and press. The fusible interfacing helps add stability and stiffness to your waistband. Pin the waistband to the skirt, right sides together. Stitch along the edge at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once you sew your waistband on, we're going to give the waistband up. We're going to press this seam allowance up and all the way around. And then this part here the seam allowance, I'm going to fold down all the way around as well. And then fold this in half. Having our fold line in place will help us when we do the zipper in the next step. So I'm just going to fold it down like that and crease it. And I have my fusible interfacing on in there, and that really helps at this step to make this a nice sort of crisp, firm waistband. So do that all the way around. Cut zipper tape above the stopper. Take your invisible zipper, flip it over, and pin it in the seam so the zipper is right sides together with your skirt. Once it's pinned, we're going to stitch along this edge with a zipper foot and try and get as close to here as possible. Unzip your zipper before you sew it. That helps get the zipper tab out of the way, otherwise it's kind of bulky to sew up here. There's my zipper like that. So now I'm lining it up right sides of the zipper to the seam allowance over here. I'm going to pin that in place, make sure it's laying nice and smooth, and repeat the process. Move the zipper tab out of the way before you get to the very end. If you wish, you can do an optional step of top stitching to the side of your zipper. I did that here, but then I ultimately decided I liked it better without. Once your zipper's in, we're going to sew the waistband down. So we already pressed the seam allowance in here and up. So what happens is the seam allowance here gets covered there. And then we stitch in the ditch here, which means to stitch right along the seam line, right in here. And that will catch, oh, I didn't do a good job pinning it there. So that when you stitch along here, it'll catch this edge and it will give a very nice clean finish to the waistband. Stitch the waistband on right along the seam line. The last step is to do the hem. Before I do hems, I like to trim up any little areas like this that are a bit uneven. And I'll just trim the seam allowance a little bit on the corners. That makes it less bulky. We're going to do a small double turn hem, so that's up about 1/4 of an inch. 1/4 of an inch. It down with a 1/4 of an inch turn all the way around. Top stitch the hem all the way around the edge of the skirt. Then give it a good press and then you're done.